work really hard, and we're very blessed, and we're very happy. But, as I've said on Main Street in Tishomingo, I've seen the culture the last 10 years in our country continue to shift more and more toward liberalism, and yes, even more and more toward socialism. I have people come into my office more and more on a regular basis with the attitude, Dustin, I'd rather take $800 a month from the government and lay on the couch, even if you pay me $2,000 a month to work. This culture that we're seeing come in the door of my office is the culture that we've seen our politicians reward. We have a president now that is teaching Americans that they should expect the government to do more for them, as opposed to what John F. Kennedy said. Remember what John F. Kennedy said? That great Democrat president? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Folks, in some 40-some-odd years, that has absolutely been turned on its head. We are a people in this country that ask not what I can do for the government, what can the government do for me. We are breeding a culture, and politicians are rewarding people with their vote, that if you will vote for them, they will help you get a job, they will help you get a check, and you'll be set for the rest of your life. Now, how many of you know that the government creates no wealth? How many of you know that? A lot of people don't know it. Every penny that the government spends comes from the people. Every penny. So the concept that the government can get us out of this mess is the concept that they're going to use our money to do it. The government has no money to do it. Secondly, how many of you agree with the concept that you can borrow your way out of debt? The president believes that we can borrow our way out of debt. Now, I've been a conservative. Honestly, I've been a conservative, and Russ can tell you because we went to college together. Before a conservative was popular, I've been a conservative. And I believe that you cannot borrow your way out of debt. Any of you ever heard of Dave Ramsey? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nicole and I have been on the envelope system for 13 years. We started on the envelope system in college, and I'll tell you, our government needs to get on the envelope system. How many of you know what the envelope system is? You put your money in the envelope, and if the money's not in the envelope, you can't buy it. That's what the envelope system is. But what I've also seen is that over the last 15 years, our country has grown the federal government, we've grown our debt, but the Republicans, I believe, Wayne, have been just as critical in growing our government as the Democrats have. So I'll stand here tonight before you and tell you I'm a Republican, yes, but first, I'm a conservative. We have to elect conservatives in the Republican Party to go back and to say no to some of the votes that they've cast and help us begin to shrink back the federal government to size. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think the Republicans have done to be a part of this grow up in government and a part of what we can do to change it. We elect politicians these days that go to Washington and vote the way the president tells them to vote or the way the party leaders tell them to vote. How many of you remember after 9/11, George Bush proposed a lot of changes in federal legislation to help make our country safer? One of those was the Patriot Act and some of these other acts. As I've sat in Tishomingo and watched this from afar, I've been perplexed at how these proposals come to life and how members of Congress that are supposed to be educated and know what they're doing vote for these things. Have you ever gone through the airport, they check your bag and you go through the airport screener? Well, prior to 9/11, when you went to the airport and went through the screener, that was handled by private employees. They were not government employees. They were contract labor that the airlines hired. They screened your bags, they checked you, you went and got on the airplane. Well, because these hijackers snuck on the plane with these box cutters, President Bush proposed that this would be made into a new government bureaucracy. And now we have the Transportation Security Administration that does the exact same thing at the airport that these private contractors used to do. Do you know what the budget is today of the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, just for that bureaucracy? Over $7 billion. Do you know why we have the Transportation Security Administration? Because a Republican president proposed it, and Republican members of Congress passed it. That's why we have it. But let me pose this question to you. How many of you have flown in the last few years? Do you feel any safer because a government employee checks your bags? Okay, well, we'll let you talk.
I refuse to fly.
How many of you feel any more safe that a government employee is checking your bag than a private contractor? I want to see a show of hands. How many of you feel how many of you feel not as safe or as same as it was when it was private contract labor at a cost of $7 billion? And who's paying for that? Remember, the government has no money. Every penny the government spends comes from you and it comes from me. Secondly, we've seen most recently the bailout. We saw President Obama propose 2 packages. One was $750 billion, another one quite more than that. And we saw him bail out many aspects of the private sector that probably just should have died on their own. Something bigger, better would replace it. Do we have any deer hunters in here? People like a deer hunter? My son's a deer hunter, and he's not here with us tonight. But I've told Price, I said, Price, if you see a buck out in the woods and it's ill and it's sick, you can't intervene and try to save that deer because it's destined to die. And what will happen in its place? A new deer will sprout up, will be stronger, healthier, will survive. We have a government today that doesn't want the private sector to live its own life. It wants to prop it up, give it artificial life. And I'm here to tell you, if General Motors had died and the government had let it die, in its place, a new capitalism would have created a new company that would have sprouted up, been better, created more jobs, and not cost you and me billions of dollars. Do I hear an amen? We have a government that's intervening in every aspect of our lives. Secondly, the government gets its money from borrowing. So there's 2 sources the federal government gets its money from. The first is from you and me, and the second is it borrows money. Now, how many of you know how much money we owe right now as we sit here today? 14.3 trillion. That's what the T.
No, that's the debt number.
That's the debt. That's what we owe. So now then, where do we owe that money? That's not all of it, but that's our national debt. Where do we owe that money? We owe it to China, and we owe it to the people, and we owe it to countries around the world. What happens when we borrow money? How many of you have ever read Proverbs 22, verse 7? The Bible tells us what happens when we borrow money. It says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave to who? To the lender. Who's the borrower? The United States. We're the slave. And who's our lender? China. Folks, the Bible gave us the answer to this many, many years ago. But we have a government that is making our country slave to the lenders, to China, and to other countries. And I think it's something that we should be scared of, and I think it's something that we should be concerned about. Thirdly, we're seeing the federal government regulate the private sector at a rate that we've never seen before. We're seeing regulation on the private business. And remember, we said that all of the money the government has comes from the private sector. People like you and me that make payroll taxes. People like you and me that pay income taxes. That's where all this money comes from. Last June, I just saw a banana split come in. It's right there. I want to tell you about a banana split.
Only one spoon. I don't even think I want to.
I had a business owner come into my office last year to hire me to be their lawyer. And what had happened was the United States Department of Labor called and said, we have had a complaint against you, and we're going to investigate you for violation of the United States Department of Labor laws. And naturally, this is a small business owner, Main Street in Tishomingo, that sells banana splits. Came in and was scared to death. I said, well, what happened? Let's get them in here. So one day, they made an appointment. 3 people showed up from the federal government to my office. They didn't walk in and say, we're with the federal government, what can we do to help? They said, we're here for the federal government, we're here to investigate. 2 men in suits from Dallas, Texas drove up in shiny sedans, and a lady from Wichita Falls, Texas in a nice suit drove up in a shiny sedan. They came into my office and they said, we've had an anonymous complaint against this business. I said, well, what's the complaint? And they said, well, we've had a complaint that they violated the child labor laws. I said, well, what did they do? They said, it is against the law for a 16 and 17-year-old to drive a car in the course of employment. I said, well, what did these kids at the Dairy Queen do? They said, well, they ran out of bananas. This is a true story. They ran out of bananas one night, and on 3 separate occasions, we've learned that they've driven 4 blocks up the street to the only grocery store in town to buy bananas. So, okay, you're here to investigate this from the United States Department of Labor. This business owner has made more car payments for high school students over 40 years than anyone in town. Put all the kids in town through college, all the kids in town through high school, and they sat there and said, we're going to go and investigate. So we let them leave, and all day long they went up and down Main Street. They went to the high school, they pulled kids out of classrooms, and they interviewed them, workers and former workers. Some workers had been fired parents, so they had a lot to say. They called me a few days later and said, Dustin, we found 5 instances where these kids have gotten in their car and driven to the Sooners to the grocery store to get bananas. And each incident carries a $10,000 fine. Now, this happened last June in Tishomingo. Folks, when that happens, when the federal government is coming in at that level, we've got a problem. We need to send people to Washington that are from Main Street. We don't need to send people from Washington that are part of a bigger issue. We need to send people that have worked on Main Street. We need to send people to Washington that know the struggles of small town government. I fought that case for 6 months, and had it not been helping a family member, they wouldn't have been able to afford a lawyer to help them. But I fought that case, and I'm proud to tell you I got it dismissed. I told them, I said, I'm going to appeal you, I'm going to fight you, and we'll go all the way to Little Rock to the appellate division. They called me a few days later, so we're dropping the case entirely. But folks, how many of you can go out and hire a lawyer to fight the government? Is it going to be that you've got to have a lawyer on call the rest of your life to fight the federal government? That's where we're headed in this country.
Come into that.
Now, some of you say, well, Dustin, we've got too many lawyers, and I'll be the first to tell you, yes, we've got a lot of them, and I don't like most of them. But there's always room for good people, and there's always room for good lawyers to fight a good fight and to do what's right. I liken it to politicians. We can all sit here and talk about politicians,